Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sumullah here. So inshallah in this video I'm going to do a book review and speak about this 1200 page book. I referenced it in my previous video where we went through a sentence from the Stories of the Prophets book, and it was a verse of the Qur'an that occurred in Surah Yusuf. So that was a 17 word sentence, and we used a particular approach called the SIDR process, where we counted the number of words and then we identified the smaller number that the larger number needs to fit into, and we proceeded to distribute those words into the major portions, and we kept repeating the process until every word was accounted for. So if you haven't watched that video, I'll throw a link to it in the description below, and you should watch that first before moving forward with this book review. Okay, because basically this is a book that's a modern book, and what it does is it goes from Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Surah Al-Fatiha, and word by word, every harf, every particle, every noun, every verb is talked about. And this is Qur'an grammar, and it's nothing else. He identifies the sentences, where they start, where they end, and then he goes from right to left, and he speaks about every word, whether it's experiencing a grammatical state or it's not. If it is, then what is the state and why? And also he speaks about the Arab indicators. So now, without any further ado, let's move it to the computer and I'll continue speaking with you there. We're going to read what he says, and we'll analyze it from two perspectives. From the way that I would normally do it in our classes, and what you saw in the previous video, where we took the sentence that I have on the screen right now and we counted the number of words, and that number was 17, and we figured out that these 17 words need to divide into three major portions. We labeled them, and then we reapplied the process until every word was properly accounted for. So all of those details that were given in the previous video are found here as well. But in addition to that, there's more that's being given here. Now, the extra things that are being given here were intentionally suppressed from the analysis in the previous videos. That's the point I need you to appreciate and understand. And why was that suppression done? Because those details, they're low yield, and they don't directly contribute to being able to segment the words into the major portions and differentiating between the subject and the predicate, and identifying clearly the musnad ilayh and the musnad. So we focused on this sentence here, وَقَالَ الْآخَرُ. Okay, so we're going to take it from the top and notice that it's actually 5 sentences. The verse is consisting of 5 sentences, starting with a wow. وَدَخَلَ مَعَهُ السِّجْنَ فَتَيَانِ. So that's a sentence in and of itself. وَدَخَلَ مَعَهُ السِّجْنَ فَتَيَانِ. قَالَ أَحَدُهُمَا إِنِّي أَرَانِي أَعْصِرُ خَمْرًا is a sentence. وَقَالَ الْآخَرُ إِنِّي أَرَانِي أَحْمِلُ فَوْقَ رَأْسِي خُبْزًا تَأْكُلُ الطَّيْرُ مِنْهُ is a sentence. نَبِّئْنَا بِتَأْوِيلِهِ is a sentence. And إِنَّا نَرَاكَ مِنَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ is a sentence. So there's a number of sentences here. In the previous video, we said ignore the wow at the front. We shouldn't really ignore it, because the wow that you see at the front, it's either combining between mufradat or it's combining between sentences. So when it's combining between sentences, you would have to look on the right side of the wow and see the sentence on which this is ma'atuf. Now, if you look in the earlier ayah, it talked about how it occurred to them after some period of time, after they saw all of the evidence and the proofs, that they should absolutely, definitely lock him away, hatta hin, until the rumors subside and people stop talking about what they're talking about. And along with him, 2 individuals, 2 young men, entered the prison. In other words, فَسُجِنَ يُوسُفُ وَدَخَلَ مَعَهُ السِّجْنَ. So Yusuf a.s. was imprisoned, and along with him 2 young men entered the prison. So this is ma'atuf on the earlier sentence, which is the start of a new paragraph, that Yusuf a.s. was imprisoned, and along with him 2 men entered the prison. So the commentator here will talk about the wow here, the significance of the wow. And then from قَالَ أَحَدُهُمَا, we have a sentence that is not nested. So when a sentence is nested, that means that it has a position in Arab. So the sentence is في محل رفع because it's khabar, or is في محل نصب, rafa, nasb, or jar because it's describing a noun which is in any of those 3 states. Like this تأكل الطير منه, this full sentence is في محل نصب. Why? Because خبزا is in nasb. So خبزا is in nasb, and تأكل الطير منه, the sentence is modifying it, so it would share the grammatical positioning that خبزا has. So this is an example of a full sentence behaving like an adjective. Behaving like an adjective. So a full sentence can become predicate, a full sentence can be a sifa, and a full sentence can also become hal. Those three, so those are the three options. So if it's any of those three things, they say that the sentence is fi mahalli blank, fi mahalli rafa, nasab, or jar. And if that's not happening, if it's not occurring in one of those three scenarios, then the term for that is istinafiya, that the sentence is istinaf, jumlatun istinafiyatun, and an istinaf sentence would be preempting a question, or it would be clarifying a vagueness, or it will be a re-elaboration of what was said in the earlier sentence. So if the sentences are too related in meaning, then this is one of the occasions where you wouldn't want to connect them with a waw or a conjunction. Like in English, this would be one of the places where an em dash could be used, or a colon could be used. Does that make sense? So these are considerations when doing i'rab, that we need to identify the sentences where they start, where they end, and the sentences if they are nested or if they are not nested. Okay? So that's the first one. And then قال أحدهما إني أراني أعصر خمرا, and قال الآخر إني أراني أحمل فوق رأسي خبزا تأكل الطير منه are two sentences connected with a waw. So for the first sentence we'd say it's a istinaf. The second sentence we'd say it's ma'atuf on the jumla musta'nifa, on the jumla istinafiya. It's ma'atuf on that. So in other words, neither of these two sentences are filling one of the 22 places. So there's no mahal of i'rab here in either of these two sentences. In the first sentence is fi'l fa'il maqula, قال أحدهما إني أراني أعصر خمرا. The maqula is inna, ism of inna, and khabar of inna. The khabar of inna is a verb of the heart. It's fa'il, which is the ana, mustatir. The maf'ul bihi number 1, which is the ya, and maf'ul bihi number 2, which is a full sentence, a'siru khamran, which then further divides into a fi'l, a fa'il, and a maf'ul bihi. And this is the sentence we did in the video, fi'l fa'il maqula. The maqula divides into an inna, an ism of inna, and a compound khabar. The khabar divides into a verb of the heart. It's fa'il, which is the ana inside it. The maf'ul bihi, maf'ul bihi number 1, which is the ya, and ahmilu fawqa ra'si khubzan ta'kulu at-tayru minhu. All of that together would be the second maf'ul bihi, which then further divides into a fi'l, a fa'il, and a maf'ul bihi of its own. And the maf'ul bihi here is not just khubzan, it's fawqa ra'si khubzan ta'kulu at-tayru minhu. And between fawqa ra'si and the khubzan ta'kulu at-tayru minhu, we have a relationship where there's a hal coming first and there's a dhul hal delayed. Okay, and this was mentioned in the previous video. And then over here, nabbi'na bi ta'wili is a sentence on its own. And it's fi'l, fa'il, maf'ul bihi, and muta'alliq. The muta'alliq is jar majrur. Bi ta'wilihi jar majrur, and the majrur is ta'wilihi mudaf mudaf ilayh. Over here, this is similar. We have an inna, an ism of inna, which is the na, and the khabar, naraka min al-muhsinin. The khabar divides into a verb of the heart, nara, followed by maf'ul bihi number 1, which is the ka, and maf'ul bihi number 2, which is a combination of min al-muhsinin and an omitted word. The omitted word and the prepositional phrase connect and form the second maf'ul bihi, and the muta'alliq is jar majrur. Okay, so this is how I would do it. Okay, so look what he says here. He says وَدَخَلَ الْوَاوَ عَاطِفَةٌ. The waw is a conjunction. So in other words, دَخَلَ مَعَهُ السِّجْنَ فَتَيَانِ, the sentence would be extended from an earlier sentence. So is it extended from this? ثُمَّ بَدَا لَهُ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا رَأَوُا الْآيَةِ لَيَسْجُنُنَّهُ حَتَّى حِينٍ. The answer is no. Because the subject of بَدَا لَهُ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا رَأَوُا الْآيَاتِ is actually the thought that occurred. So there's a particular thought that occurred to them. What was that thought? That thought was لَا يَسْجُنُنَّهُ, that they should absolutely imprison him. So over here we have a thought occurring, and over here we have two men entering the prison. So they're unrelated. So using a waw to connect between them would be invalid. So he's saying this is atifa, dakhala fi'lun madin, but then what is it connecting on? He hasn't told us that yet. So he gets into the minutia. Okay, and this is the criticism I have with this book, right? So I want to know, what is the ma'tuf on? Can you see that? So he said, دخل فعل ماض مبني على الفتح. دخل is a madi verb. So this is a word level discussion. So right now he's focusing on the word, and he's saying دخل is a madi verb that's mabni on a fatah. In other words, it itself doesn't have any grammatical positioning. دخل itself doesn't have any grammatical positioning because madi verbs don't have any particles that can come before them and cause change to the end of them, similar to how a mudari would have that. Like يفعل, لن يفعل, لم يفعل. So يفعل, when there's no nasab giving agent or jazm giving agent, then by default the verb, mudari verb, would be in rafa. That doesn't apply to the madi. Because all of the particles that enter on the madi verb are non-governing agents, like qad or ma, like ma dakhala or qad dakhala. You see, so they don't change and alter the way that the verb looks. So دخل فعل ماض مبني على الفتح. دخل is a madi verb that's mabni on fatha. So it's fixed on a fatha. So the significance of that fatha is nothing. It's just the way it's built. Moving on. He says maʿahu, this compound structure, maʿahu, is an adverbial structure. In other words, it's maf'ul fi, ظرف, mansubun. So it's in the place of it's mansub. It's mansub, and when something's mansub, it means that it's being used in one of the middle 12 of the 22 possible ways an ism could be used, and that happens to be what we call maf'ul fi. So what we call maf'ul fi is calling dharf, same thing. ظرف منصوب متعلق بدخل. So it's the answer to the question where. It's the answer to the question where in consideration of entry. Okay, so the entry is happening along with him. An argument could be made that the people are entering and the people are along with him when they're doing the entering. So an argument could be made that maʻahu is actually modifying fatayan and it's not connecting to dakhala directly. You can think about that if you want. And then he moves on to the who. He says, وَالضَّمِيرُ فِي مَحَلِّ جَرٍ مُضَافٍ إِلَيْهِ. And the pronoun that's attached to maʻahu is in the place of jar. He doesn't say it's majrur, because when speaking about things that are mu'rab, then we use the terms marfu', mansub, and majrur. And when talking about things that are mabni, like pronouns, then we say it's mabni / in the place of jar, as opposed to majrur. They both mean the same thing. Majrur is an adjective, and in the place of jar is a translation of that adjective. It literally means the same thing. But conventionally, when these scholars of i'rab, when these grammarians, when they speak, they assign the terminology accordingly. So when speaking about words like Zayd or Rajul or Fatayan or Sijna, they won't say in the place of nasab, they'll say mansub. Ma'a is mu'rab. It's an adverb, it's an ism, it's not a pronoun. Ma'a is not a pronoun. So ma'a, he calls it mansub. He doesn't say in the place of nasab, he calls it mansub. The who, he says it's in the place of jar. Why is it in the place of jar? He drills down deeper and he says mudaf ilayh, on the basis of mudaf ilayh, which is true. As-sijna maf'ulun bihi mansubun bil fathati. It's a maf'ul bihi and it's mansub, and the nasab is reflected with the fatha, as-sijna. In other words, it's a normal word. Okay, fatayan is the fa'il for dakhala. So look what he says. It's a fa'ilun marfu'un bil alif. It's a fa'il which is in rafa with the alif. But saying fa'il already presupposes it's in rafa. Does that make sense? Something can't be fa'il unless it's in rafa. So that already presupposes that. And the fact that the rafa is being reflected with an alif is true, but did it really need to be mentioned? Did you understand that? Did you have to say that? Does it contribute to the tafsir? Does it add to the translation? Okay, put a pin on that, what I just said there. وَالْجُمْلَةُ لَا مَحَلَّ لَهَا. Okay, so now we have all of our components. We have our fi'l, we have our maf'ul fi, we have our maf'ul bihi, and we have our fa'il. He says all four of those together connect. So in our method, we'd say the sentence divides into 4 parts. Okay, here they are, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then if any one of them is compound, we'd zoom in and we say maʻahu divides into mudaf mudaf ilayh, we're done. In his method, he talks about each one separately, and then once all 4 are there, then he'll wrap it up. Now, if the 4th one had an extension, he wouldn't wait for that extension to finish, but he'll wrap it up and then he'll talk about the extension. Put a pin on that as well. Okay, put a pin on that. Let's keep going. Okay, so now with all of those four there, he says, وَالْجُمْلَةُ لَا مَحَلَّ لَهَا, and the sentence does not have a position in i'rab. In other words, it's not nested. لا محل لها معطوفة على استنافية مقدرة, and it's connected via the waw on an earlier sentence, which is the initiation of a new paragraph. In other words, a non-nested earlier sentence, which is assumed. مقدرة means assumed. So which means it's not معطوف on ثم بدا لهم من بعد ما والآيات. It's not معطوف on that because the conditions of atf of jumal are not being met. In order for atf of sentences to occur, the two sentences need to be somewhat related but not too related. In other words, they have to be united in the file. Opposites would work. Zaydun yu'ti wa yamna. That's fine. Yu'ti wa yamna. So Zayd gives and he prevents. He gives and he withholds. Or inna al-abrara lafi na'im wa inna al-fujjara lafi jahim. So over there we have the first sentence and the second sentence connected with a waw, and that's a valid atf. Over here we have Yusuf being in prison, and we have two other people entering the prison. So that works. Okay, but the thought occurring doesn't really work. So he says that. He says, أي فسجد يوسف, Yusuf was in prison, ودخل. Okay, moving on. The next sentence. قال فعل, and now we can pick up some speed. فعل ماض مبني على الفتح. So قال is the ماضي verb, مبني على الفتح. أحدهما is the fa'il. فاعل مرفوع بالضمة. Okay, so the dal has a dhamma. والضمير هما في محل جر مضاف إليه. And the second word there is the مضاف إليه, and it's in the place of jar on the basis of مضاف إليه. Okay, moving on. So now we're into the maqula. But he hasn't told us that yet. He hasn't said that we're into the maqula. He says, inna harfu tawkidin wa nasb. So he categorizes the particle inna. We would call it a harf mushabbah bil fi'l, because that's the term that, this group of particles are called the huruf mushabbaha bil fi'l. One second. He says, inna harfu tawkidin wa nasb. So he highlights the feature and function and the governing, like how exactly it governs. So it introduces into the sentence emphasis, and it causes nasab, which is fine. Inna harfu tawkidin wa nasb wa ya'ul mutakallim ismuha. And the ya first person is the ism of inna fi mahalli nasb, in the place of nasab. Again, because it's a pronoun, he doesn't refer to it as mansub, he calls it in the place of nasab. So the terminology change, and that's just a convention. Moving on to the predicate of inna, but he hasn't told us that. He says, arani fi'lun mudari'un marfu'un bidhammatin muqaddaratin 'ala al-alifi. So here we have a mudari verb speaking specifically about the ara, not the whole thing, just the ara. Excuse me. He says it's a fi'l mudari, is marfu' with an assumed dhamma, with a dhamma which is assumed on the alif. Why is it assumed on the alif? Because the alif is a weak letter, and pronouncing a dhamma on an alif is problematic. And there's a phonetic difficulty there. It's called ta'adhur. مَنَعَ مِنْ ظُهُورِهَا التَّعَذُّرِ. So he spared us those extra details, but he said some of it. And he said, so why is it in Rafa? He hasn't told us that. The reason for the Rafa is because of absence of nasab giver and jazm giver. So there's no lan and there's no lam, and that's the reason for the Rafa, but he never told us that. You see? Okay, does that make sense? But I would have skipped both of those things. I would have skipped the mudari verb being in Rafa, and the fact that his Rafa is reflected with a dhamma, and the dhamma is assumed on the alif because alif is a weak letter, and pronouncing a dhamma on an alif is problematic. I would have skipped all of that because it doesn't lend itself to comprehension. You see? وَالنُّونُ لِلْوِقَايَةِ, and the noon is for preservation. In other words, it's not even a part of speech. It's a letter of the alphabet that was added there, and it's not contributing to the meaning whatsoever. And it's there purely for pronunciation issue in order to protect the verb from receiving a kasra, because ya necessitates kasra. You see, so this noon is added to verbs, but it's not added to isms. Like kitabi is okay, but darabi is not okay. You have to say darabani, he hit me. You can't say darabi. You see, and over here the alif, it would have needed to be araya,
but that's awkward, so arani. And it's consistent. It's consistent. وَيَاءُ الْمُتَكَلِّمِ مَفْعُولٌ بِهِ أَوَّلُ فِي مَحَلِّ نَصْبٍ. And the ya of first person is the first maf'ul bihi that's in the place of nasab. So far so good. So in other words, we're expecting there to be two maf'ul bihis, but he hasn't told us that. So we have to connect the dots ourselves, right? Okay, moving on. أعصر فعل مضارع مرفوع بالضمة. Okay, same what he said about ara there, except over here it's a real dhamma. Over there it was an assumed dhamma in ara. والفاعل أنا. And the fa'il of the verb is the implicit pronoun أنا. خمرا مفعول به منصوب بالفتحة. It's a maf'ul bihi which is mansub because of the reflected through the fatha at the end. Khamran. In other words, it's a normal word. Okay, now tying up a'siru khamran. Okay, just this part, because it's a full sentence, right? Every time you have a verb, you have a full sentence. Wherever there's a verb, that's the beginning of a full sentence. So he says, وَالْجُمْلَةُ فِي مَحَلِّ نَصْبٍ مَفْعُولٌ ثَانٍ لِلْفِعْلِ أَرَى. And the sentence, in other words, the three things, أعصر, it's أنا and it's خمرا, all three of them together connect and form the second مفعول به. مفعول ثان للفعل أرى, for the verb أرى. Okay, now going backwards, he says وَجُمْلَةُ أَرَانِي. And now the verb of the heart, along with his two مفعول بهs, في محل رفع, is in the place of رفع. In other words, it's nested. So when he says في محل رفع, over there he said في محل نصب. So whenever a sentence is categorized as fi mahalli something, then the implication is that this is a nested sentence. So over there, in the very first sentence, in the qāla أحدهما or the دخل معه السجن, actually it doesn't work there because it's ma'atuf, right? It's ma'atuf. Or qāla أحدهما, the full thing would be non-nested. Like within it, there's multiple sentences, but as a whole, قال أحدهما إني أراني أعصر خمرا is لا محل لها من الإعراب, as opposed to في محل blank. Okay, so hopefully you're understanding this. We're down here. وجملة إني أراني, and incorporating the إني, so we're at the مقول القول level, مقولة level. في محل نصب مقول القول, and the entire sentence beginning at إني أراني until خمرا, all of that, incorporating everything, including خمرا, is في محل نصب مقول القول. All of that is in the place of nasab as a quoted statement. وجملة القول استئنافية, and the full sentence incorporating the قال and the أحدهما is non-nested, is استئنافية. Okay, moving on. وقال الآخر الواو عاطفة. Okay, قال مثل السابقة. In other words, it's a فعل ماضي مبني على الفتح. الآخر فاعل مرفوع بالضمة. Okay, it's a fa'il in the state of fa'il which is marfu, reflected with the dhamma. إني أراني أحمل. Okay, he says مر إعراب نظيرها. A comparable sentence, the parsing of a comparable sentence just passed. In other words, we have حرف توكيد ونصب. We have the ism of إن في محل نصب, the ya pronoun, and then we have أراني, a fa'il, which is the ana. Okay, did he even tell us that there's an ana inside it? He did. وَالْفَاعِلُ ana. Up there. For asiru, he said وَالْفَاعِلُ ana. Over here, did he say that the fa'il is ana? Ara? Okay, you see, he skipped it. Okay, subhanallah. He says فِعْلٌ مُضَارِعٌ مَرْفُوعٌ بِضَمَّةٍ مُقَدَّرَةٍ أَلِفِ, and then he should have said وَالْفَاعِلُ ana. وَالنُّونُ لِلْوِقَايَةِ. You see? Okay, so there's no justification for that skip. So if you're going to be consistent, you got to do everything. Or just don't do it at all. Which is, okay. Is that fine? Moving forward. Okay, مَرَّ إِعْرَابُ نَظِيرِهَا. Okay, that's done. أَحْمِلُ فَوْقَ رَأْسِي, all of that together. Is the second maf'ul bihi. Ahmilu introduces the second maf'ul bihi. Okay, but then he's not going to tell us that until later. So right now, ahmilu is a mudari verb, marfu with the dhamma. فوق ظرف مكان منصوب في محل نصب حال من خبزا. And I talked about this in the previous video. So he's saying a number of things here. He's saying that first it's a ظرف makan, in other words, answer to the question where. It's mansub, and the reason for the nasb is not في محل نصب حال. The reason for the nasb is مفعول فيه for محذوف, which would be كائنا or مستقرا. And كائنا means situated. مستقرا is like well situated in a path. So prepositional phrases, when they go on to become a sifa or a hal, they need to first link to a verb or a verb-like entity and become muta'alliq or become maf'ul fi, and then go on to become hal. If that makes sense. So I'm not going to elaborate further. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it there. Right? So it's maf'ul fi. So dharfu makan means maf'ul fi. Mansub is, so I would switch it and I would say fawqa is mansub on the basis of maf'ul fi. For what? Not for khubzan, but for the omitted word situated. Fi mahalli nasb, and then the whole thing goes on to fi mahalli nasbin, to be in the place of nasb on the basis of hal from the word khubzan, because every hal presupposes a sahibul hal. That you can't have a hal unless there's a dhul hal sahibul hal, like Zayd came to me riding, and this was talked about in the previous video. So رأسي مضاف إليه مجرور بكسرة مقدرة على ما قبل ياء المتكلم. رأسي is majrur on the basis of mudaf ilayh, and the jar is reflected not with the kasra that's on the scene, but with another kasra that's been replaced by this kasra. So it's a kasra that's assumed on the letter that's immediately preceding the ya of first person, because if it was in rafa it would still be ra'si, and if it was in nasab it would still be ra'si. So you can't attribute the kasra on the scene to the mudaf ilayh. So that's what he's doing here. Okay, so I highlighted that purposefully because I know it's not important. Okay, so this is the lesson that I'm trying to get across here. Okay, وَالْيَاءُ فِي مَحَلِّ جَرٍ مُضَافِ إِلَيْهِ. And as for the ya itself, it's in the place of jar on the basis of مضاف إليه. Okay, that's done. خُبْزًا مَفْعُولٌ بِهِ مَنْصُوبٌ لِأَحْمِلٍ. خُبْزًا is a مفعول به منصوب due to أحمل. In other words, it's the مفعول به for أحمل. وَالْجُمْلَةُ فِي مَحَلِّ نَصْبٍ. Okay, so now all of the components of أحمل فوق رأسي خبزًا are done, but then خبزًا has an extension coming later. So he's not going to wait for that extension to, remember I said put a pin on that, remember? so he's not going to wait until تأكل الطير منه has also been parsed in order to tie it up. So it's like a little prematurely or a little impatiently, he ties up the second maf'ul bihi for ara, even though some of that second maf'ul bihi is ta'kulu tayru minhu. But extensions are talked about after the fact in this methodology. So as long as he does that consistently, I would have no issue with it. I would disagree with it in terms of whether it's optimal or not, right? But the point is that if you commit to a process, be consistent with it. Okay, so no criticism on the author at this stage right now. So he ties it up, even though some of it's still upcoming. He says, وَالْجُمْلَةُ فِي مَحَلِّ نَصْبٍ مَفْعُولٌ ثَانٍ لِأَرَانِي. وَجُمْلَةُ أَرَانِي فِي مَحَلِّ رَفْعٍ خَبَرُ وِنَّ. And the greater sentence, starting from 2 words earlier, is in the place of rafa because it's the khabar winna. And the sentence that started on inni is fi mahalli nasbin maqulul qawl, and this is what I meant when I said in the previous video that he does it backwards. And I think that's clear. Wa jumlatul qawl, and as for the qāla al-akharu, he's going to say it's ma'tuf on the istinafiyya before. Wa jumlatul qawl la mahalla laha, doesn't have a position in i'rab, and it's ma'tuf on the jumlatul qawl as-sabiqa. Okay, ta'kulu fi'lun mudari'un marfu'un bid-dhammati. It's a mudari verb that's marfu, reflected with the dhamma. الطير فاعل مرفوع بالضمة. Pretty straightforward. منه جار ومجرور متعلق بتأكل. And منه would be the prepositional phrase connecting to تأكل, further divided into jar and majrur, and that concludes the analysis. Actually, نبئنا بتأويله will do that as well, and إنا نراك من المحسنين will do that as well. But the تأكل الطير منه, he says والجملة في محل نصب نعت لخبزا. And this sentence is in the place of nasb because it's modifying khubzan. In other words, it's sifa. نبئنا فعل أمر مبني على السكون. نبئ. It's a command verb. So word level. So it's not parsing. So he's just telling you what kind of word it is. It's mabni on sukun. So in other words, there's no governing agent. And there's no grammatical state for nabbi. As opposed to a mudari verb, for example, would have a state. وَالْفَاعِلُ أَنْتَ. And the fa'il within it is the anta. You. وَالضَّمِيرُ نَا فِي مَحَلِّ نَصْبٍ مَفْعُولٍ بِهِ. And the pronoun na is in the place of nasab because it's the maf'ul bihi. So far so good. بِتَأْوِيلِهِ جَارٌ وَمَجْرُورٌ مُتَعَلِّقٌ بِنَبِّ. This is fine as well. Here we have a prepositional phrase that connects to nabbi, further divided into jar majrur, and the majrur divides into mudaf mudaf ilayh. Okay, والهاء جار ومجرور متعلق بنبي والهاء في محل جر مضاف إليه. That's fine. والجملة لا محل لها استئناف في حيز القول. Okay, this is cool. So he's saying that نبئنا بتأويله is actually within the confines of the quoted statement. Okay, so this is a good detail that I overlooked when I was analyzing it. So this is within the confines. في حيز means within the confines of the quoted statement. And إِنَّا نَرَاكَ مِنَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, إِنَّا نَرَاكَ مِنَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ is made up of an إِنَّا أَنَا, and it's similar to إِنِّي. So whatever we said about إِنِّي, we're going to say about إِنَّا. And نَرَاكَ مِنَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ is similar to the أَرَانِي because it's a verb of the heart, so it too has two maf'ul bihis. So in the مِنَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, this prepositional phrase does not connect to nara. It's in the place of nasab, which means that it connects to a maḥdhuf, which ultimately goes on to become the second maf'ul bihi. Okay, so he says من المحسنين جار ومجرور في محل نصب مفعول ثاني لنراك والجملة في محل رفع خبر إن. And the نراك من المحسنين sentence is in the place of rafa because it's the khabar of inna, and the whole thing وجملة إن لا محل لها doesn't have any grammatical positioning because it's a istinaf. It's a non-nested sentence. The purpose is either bayan or ta'lil. In other words, it's going to be one of the two. It can't be either or. It's a bayani means it's preempting. Like, why are you asking me? So the question is, why are you asking me? Inna naraka min al-muhsinin. Or you could just say it's a straight up because sentence. Because we find you to be, because we believe you to be of those that extend favor. And that concludes this segment